Deputy Logan Weaver pulled up to the neighbor's house on Mill Creek Road just after midnight. The 911 call had come in frantic. A woman screaming. Something about a gun. When Weaver got out of his cruiser and approached the property, he didn't find the victim standing on the porch. He didn't find her inside the neighbor's living room. He didn't find her in the yard. He found her hiding inside a plastic storage box, the kind people use to keep pool floats and chlorine tablets. She had folded herself into this container, pulled the lid down, and stayed perfectly still because she believed the man who had just beaten her, dragged her through their home, and pressed a loaded handgun against her skull, was still out there looking for her. The woman had blood matting her hair from a 3-inch gash on the back of her head. Bruises were already forming across her body. And an 11-year-old child had watched the whole thing happen. The man responsible was Nicholas Byron Cargain, and by the time the justice system was finished with him, he would never see the outside of a prison again. But to understand how one night in rural Georgia ended with a life sentence, we need to go back to the beginning. Crandall is the kind of place most people drive through without realizing they've entered it. It sits in Murray County, deep in the northwest corner of Georgia, where the Appalachian foothills roll into the Chattahoochee National Forest. The nearest city of any real size is Chatsworth, the county seat. And even that only has about 10,000 people. This is a community where everybody knows everybody, where you wave at the car coming the other direction, even if you don't recognize it, where most disputes between neighbors get settled with a conversation, not a courtroom. Nicholas Byron Cargain lived at 520 Mill Creek Road in Crandall. He was 32 years old at the time of the incident. He lived there with his girlfriend, Cassidy, and her 11-year-old child. From the outside, it looked like any other rural household. A house on a quiet road, neighbors within walking distance. The kind of place where you leave your front door unlocked because you figure nobody's coming to cause trouble. But what was happening behind the walls of that house was something else entirely. Domestic violence rarely announces itself to the outside world. It builds in private, it escalates in silence, and by the time anyone else finds out, the situation has usually already reached a breaking point. What the neighbors on Mill Creek Road didn't know, what the community didn't see, was that Cassidy was living with a man who was becoming increasingly dangerous. And on the night of June 2nd, 2024, everything that had been simmering behind closed doors finally boiled over. This is where the story stops being about a quiet town in North Georgia and starts being about survival. The evening of June 2nd, 2024, started like any other at the house on Mill Creek Road. Cassidy was home with her 11-year-old child, and Nicholas Cargain was there too. What exactly triggered the violence that night has never been made fully public. The district attorney's office would later describe the events as occurring between the evening of June 2 and June 3, 2024. What we know for certain is what happened once things escalated. At some point during the evening, Cassidy tried to leave. That's the detail that matters most in understanding what happened next. She didn't start a fight. She didn't escalate the situation. She tried to walk out the door, and that's when Nicholas Cargain made his choice. As Cassidy moved toward the front door of the house, Cargain grabbed her. He physically dragged her away from the exit, pulling her from the front door back, through the house, and into the kitchen. From the kitchen, he dragged her into a bedroom. Think about that for a second. She was at the door. She was seconds from being outside, from being free, from being safe. And he pulled her back inside, room by room, deeper into the house, further from any escape. Once they were in the bedroom, the assault escalated beyond anything Cassidy could have prepared for. Based on what later came out at trial, Cargain attacked her with multiple objects. He beat her with items found around the room. The injuries would later be documented as extensive bruising. Across her body, scrapes and cuts, and a 3-inch gash on the back of her head that was deep enough to require surgical staples at the emergency room. But the beating wasn't even the worst of it. During the assault, Cargain picked up a handgun. He pressed it against Cassidy's head, and he told her he was going to kill her. Now, we need to pause here and acknowledge something that makes this case even more disturbing. Cassidy was not alone in that house with Cargain. Her 11-year-old child was there, in the house, able to see and hear what was happening. An 11-year-old listening to a man threaten to murder their mother, hearing the sounds of violence through the walls, watching a situation unfold that no child should ever have to witness. The original arrest report from the Murray County Sheriff's Office listed the charges against Cargain, and one of them tells you just how bad that night really was. Among the initial charges was battery on an unborn child, which likely means Cassidy was pregnant at the time of the attack. He didn't care about her, about the child watching, about any of it. But here's the part of this story that still keeps people up at night. The part that separates this case from so many other domestic violence cases that end in tragedy. Cassidy got out, somehow in the middle of being beaten, in the middle of having a gun held to her head, in the middle of being told she was going to die. Cassidy found a moment, a split second where Cargain's grip loosened, where his attention shifted, where something gave her just enough of an opening. And she ran. She broke free from that bedroom, sprinted through the house, and made it out the door. Barefoot, bleeding, terrified, she ran to the neighbor's house, the house next door on Mill Creek Road, the only place she could think of that might be safe. When she reached the neighbor's door, the neighbor let her in and immediately called 911. The call was frantic. A woman had shown up covered in blood, saying her boyfriend had a gun and was going to kill her. But even inside the neighbor's house, Cassidy didn't feel safe. She knew Cargain. She knew what he was capable of, and she was terrified that he would come looking for her. So she did something that speaks to a level of fear most people will never experience in their entire lives. She went outside to the neighbor's yard, found a large plastic storage container, the kind used to hold swimming pool equipment, and she climbed inside. She pulled the lid over herself, and she hid. A grown woman, beaten and bleeding, curled up inside a plastic box in a neighbor's backyard, hoping the man she lived with wouldn't find her. That image tells you everything about what life with Nicholas Cargain had become. Murray County Sheriff's Office Deputy Logan Weaver was the first officer on scene. He pulled up to the neighbor's house, stepped out of his cruiser, and started figuring out what had happened. The neighbor directed Weaver to where Cassidy was, and that's when the deputy found her, crouched inside a pool equipment box, trembling, injured, still afraid that Cargain might appear at any moment. Getting Cassidy out of that box and to safety was the first priority. The injuries were visible immediately. The gash on her head was still bleeding. The bruises were darkening. She needed medical attention, and she needed it fast. She would later receive staples to close the wound on the back of her head at the emergency room. But the investigation was just getting started. Deputy Weaver secured the scene and called for backup. Detective Joshua Malone from the Murray County Sheriff's Office was assigned as the lead investigator on the case. Over the hours and days that followed, Malone and his team began piecing together exactly what had happened at 520 Mill Creek Road. The evidence painted a clear and horrifying picture. The path of the attack could be traced through the house, from the front door where Cassidy had tried to leave, through the kitchen where she'd been dragged, and into the bedroom where the worst of the assault took place. The gun was recovered. The injuries were documented and photographed. Cargain was taken into custody by the Murray County Sheriff's Office, and when the full list of charges was read, it gave you a sense of just how many different ways he had terrorized Cassidy that night. 4 counts of aggravated assault under the family violence statute, kidnapping, battery on an unborn child, simple battery under family violence, pointing or aiming a gun at another person, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, criminal trespass with family violence, cruelty to children, and terroristic threats and acts under family violence. That's over a dozen charges from a single night. Cargain was booked into the Murray County Jail, and as the wheels of the justice system began turning, the case would sit for nearly a year before it reached a courtroom. But in the meantime, Cassidy took legal action of her own. Court records show she filed for divorce and separation from Cargain in Murray County Superior Court. She had survived the worst night of her life. Now came the next fight, making sure the man who did this to her would face real consequences. If cases like this one hit you as hard as they hit me, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We cover cases like this every week. Stories about survival, justice, and the moments that change everything. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. So the evidence was there, the victim was alive and willing to talk, and the witnesses were cooperating. You'd think the rest would be simple. It wasn't. The case against Nicholas Cargain should have been, by all measures, one of the more straightforward prosecutions Murray County had seen in years. The injuries were documented. The weapon was recovered. There were multiple witnesses, including an 11-year-old child who had been present for the entire ordeal. The case fell under the jurisdiction of the Conasauga Judicial Circuit. Assistant District Attorney Dixon Lackey was assigned to prosecute. On the defense side, Cargain retained local attorney Jim Toland. Detective Joshua Malone continued building the case throughout the rest of 2024 and into 2025. The investigation involved not just the physical evidence from the scene, but testimony from the key witnesses who would eventually take the stand. 4 witnesses formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. First, Cassidy herself, the victim, the woman who had been beaten, threatened with a loaded gun, and forced to hide in a plastic box to save her own life. Her testimony would be the most important piece of the entire trial. Second, the 11-year-old child, a minor who had witnessed the violence firsthand. Having a child testify in a domestic violence case adds layers of complexity. The prosecution had to balance the need for the child's account with the emotional toll of putting an 11-year-old on the stand to describe watching someone they know terrorize their mother. Third, the neighbor, the person who opened their door to a bleeding, terrified woman in the middle of the night and called 911. The neighbor who had watched Cassidy climb into a storage box because she was too afraid to stay inside the house. And fourth, Deputy Logan Weaver, the first responding officer, the person who found Cassidy in that box and documented the scene. District Attorney victim advocates Ashlyn Elrod and Cleopatra Guerrero, along with DA. Investigator Kevin Kaler worked extensively in the months before trial to prepare the witnesses and ensure the case was airtight. The indictment that went before the grand jury was extensive. By the time the formal charges were set for trial, the prosecution was moving forward on multiple counts of aggravated assault under the family violence statute. kidnapping with bodily injury, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, terroristic threats, family violence battery, and cruelty to children in the third degree. Nearly a full year after the night, on Mill Creek Road, the case of State of Georgia v. Nicholas Byron Cargain was set for trial. Chief Superior, Court Judge Cindy Morris, would preside. Cassidy would have to walk into that courtroom. She would have to sit feet away from the man who had pressed a gun to her head, and she would have to tell a room full of strangers exactly what happened to her. The 11-year-old would have to do the same. This is the part of the justice system that people don't talk about enough. The trial isn't just about evidence and legal arguments. For the victim, the trial is a second ordeal. You have to relive the worst moment of your life in public while the person who hurt you watches. The trial began on Wednesday, June 4th, 2025, in Murray County Superior Court. Chief Judge Cindy Morris presided over the proceedings. A Murray County jury was seated. Assistant DA Dixon Lackey opened for the prosecution. Jim Toland represented the defense. Over the next 3 days, the jury heard testimony from the 4 states' witnesses. Each one added another layer to the picture of what happened on the night of June 2nd. Cassidy took the stand and described the attack in detail, how she tried to leave, how Cargain grabbed her and dragged her back through the house, from the front door to the kitchen to the bedroom, how he struck her with multiple objects, how he picked up the handgun and placed it against her head, how he told her he was going to kill her. She described the moment she broke free, the desperate sprint to the neighbor's house, and the decision to hide inside a pool equipment box because she was so afraid he would come after her. The 11-year-old testified about what they saw and heard. An 11-year-old on a witness stand recounting the night their mother was beaten and nearly killed. Whatever you imagine that testimony sounded like, the reality was probably worse. The neighbor described opening the door to find a bleeding, hysterical woman begging for help. Deputy Weaver described arriving on scene and finding the victim curled inside a storage container in the backyard. Cargain's attorney, Jim Toland, presented the defense's case. A close friend of Cargain's took the stand to testify on his behalf. The specifics of what the defense argued have not been widely reported, but it seems like the approach was less about denying what happened and more about pushing back on how the charges were framed. On Friday, June 6th, after hearing all the evidence, the jury retired to deliberate. For 4 hours, 12 citizens of Murray County reviewed the testimony, examined the evidence, and weighed the charges. Then they came back. The jury found Nicholas Byron Cargain guilty on 6 counts, guilty of kidnapping with bodily injury. That was the big one. Under Georgia law, the only available sentence for that charge is life in prison. Not a number of years, not a range. Life, with no alternative. Guilty of 1 count of family violence, aggravated assault. He had been charged with 5 counts of aggravated assault, and the jury found him not guilty on 4 of them. But 1 was enough. Under Georgia law, that single count carried a sentence of 3 to 20 years. Guilty of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. That carries a mandatory 5-year sentence that must be served consecutively, meaning it gets added on top of everything else. Guilty of terroristic threats, guilty of family violence battery, and guilty of cruelty to children in the 3rd degree. 6 guilty verdicts after 4 hours of deliberation. But this is where something unusual happened. After the verdict was read, a problem was discovered with the verdict form used by the jury. The terroristic threats count had an inconsistency in how the jury had recorded their decision. It was a technicality, a clerical issue with the form itself, not a reflection of the evidence. Both sides agreed, and Judge Morris entered a dismissal of the terroristic threats count. It didn't change the outcome. The kidnapping conviction alone guaranteed Cargain would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But it was an imperfection in what was otherwise a decisive verdict. 10 days after the guilty verdict, Nicholas Byron Cargain stood before Chief Judge Cindy Morris for sentencing. Before the sentence was handed down, the judge heard from one more person. The same close friend of Cargain's who had testified during the trial took the stand again, this time, to speak at the sentencing hearing. What they said in Cargain's defense was apparently not enough to make a difference. Judge Morris went through the charges one by one. For kidnapping with bodily injury, the sentence was life in prison. Under Georgia law, there is no alternative. A conviction on that charge means life, period. For family violence aggravated, assault, the judge imposed the maximum, 20 years to be served consecutively after the life sentence. For possession of a firearm, during the commission of a felony, 5 years, also consecutive. Under Georgia law, that gun charge gets added on top of everything else. It doesn't run at the same time. For family violence battery, 12 months. For cruelty to children in the 3rd degree, 12 months. Those last 2 sentences would run concurrently with each other and with the kidnapping count. When you add it all up, Nicholas Byron Cargain received a sentence of life in prison, followed by 25 additional years of confinement. He faced a maximum possible sentence of life plus 32 years. The judge gave him very close to the maximum. He will die in a Georgia state prison. District Attorney Benjamin Kennemer's office released a statement following the sentencing. The prosecutors credited the courage of the victim, the testimony of the 11-year-old, the neighbor who answered the door that night, and Deputy Weaver. They also acknowledged the investigative work of Detective Joshua Malone and the victim advocates, who had worked with Cassidy throughout the process. This was not a case built on DNA evidence or surveillance footage or a brilliant detective catching a break. This was a case built almost entirely on the courage of a woman who had every reason to stay silent and chose not to. Cassidy walked into that courtroom, looked at the man who had tried to kill her, and told the truth. And the 11-year-old did the same. That takes a kind of courage you can't fake, and it's the reason Nicholas Cargain will never hurt anyone again. As of today, Nicholas Byron Cargain is incarcerated in the Georgia State Prison System, serving a life sentence plus 25 years. He has no realistic path to freedom. The kidnapping with bodily injury conviction carries a mandatory sentence with no possibility of early release under standard conditions. Cassidy filed a separation case against Cargain in Murray County Superior Court. She is rebuilding. The child who witnessed that night is growing up. What they carry from that experience, only time will tell. This case matters because of what it represents. Every year, thousands of domestic violence victims try to leave, and the most dangerous moment in any abusive relationship is the moment the victim tries to walk out the door. Because that's when the violence escalates, when abusers feel their control slipping, and when people get killed. Cassidy tried to leave. Cargain dragged her back inside. She tried again, and the second time she made it. She ran to a neighbor's house, hid inside a plastic box, and survived long enough for the police to arrive. A year later, she walked into a courtroom and made sure the man who did this to her would never have the chance to do it to anyone else. If you or someone you know is in a situation like this, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START to 88788. Help exists. Getting out is possible. And sometimes Survival means hiding in a box until the sirens get close enough. If this case stayed with you, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed and hit the notification bell. We cover cases like this regularly, stories about survival, justice, and the moments that define the rest of someone's life. The next video is already on screen. I'll see you there.